Okay. All right. So my talk is going to be, in a certain way, continuation of Aaron's very sober and sobering talk. And the question I will be looking at is there a priest in the house? Can we identify Jewish priests, Kohanim, in the archaeological record of the Roman period? While Aaron asked us to look at the glass being half full, unfortunately I'm going to have to look at the half empty part of the glass, and I'm going to cut to the chase and answer this question right from the beginning. In most cases, I don't know if there was a priest in the house. I don't know, and neither do you or anybody else. That's the bottom line. How much time do I have left? All right. So I'll unpack that statement in the rest of my talk. Very often we find scholars claiming that this house is priestly. And as an example, I'm giving one of the houses excavated by Nachman Avigad in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. We all find a statement that this entire neighborhood is priestly. Again, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, the upper city of Jerusalem. An entire settlement is priestly. In this example, Sepphoris, often identified as a priestly settlement city. And in one case, even an entire region is identified as being priestly. The South Hebron Hills, this relates to a slightly later period, the Byzantine period. We find tombs that are identified as priestly. We find certain archaeological phenomena that are identified as priestly. For example, certain kinds of ritual baths, which are identified as being priestly. And in looking at all these examples of all these identifications of things being priestly, I've come up with a number of reasons for identifying any particular remains as being priestly. I've come up with 5. I'm sure I can come up with more if I gave it some more thought. The first is an inscription which bears the title priest, whether it's in Hebrew, Kohen, or in Greek, Hereus. An inscription which doesn't actually say priest, but it has a priestly personal or family name. Historical sources which might point to certain remains as being priestly. Association of the remains with certain priestly interests, whether it's purity or the temple. And finally, association with wealth, which is often seen as being an indication of priestly status. What I'd like to do with the time that I have in this lecture is to unpack each of these reasons for identifying remains as priestly and to see if these are actually good reasons for identifying something as having to do with Jewish priests during the Roman period. So let's begin with the first one. An inscription bearing the title priest. We find inscriptions from the Roman period which bear the title priest, whether it's in Hebrew, Kohen, or Greek, Hereus. So for example, we have here the famous Theodotos inscription discovered in the lower city of Jerusalem, where we have Theodotos, who is said to have built the synagogue, which bears his name. He is called a priest. Examples where we have the title priest, I think it's kind of hard to argue that we don't have a priest here. When I say a priest, what I mean is somebody who sees himself as being a priest and others see him as being a priest. I think that's the easiest definition that we can give. Clearly, Theodotos, or whoever wrote this inscription, saw Theodotos as being a priest. I think that my skepticism reaches its limit here. And we have other examples. We have tombs in which we have the title priest clearly stated here. For example, the tomb of the sons of Chizir, which are clearly referred to as Kohanim, priests. So having an inscription which says clearly the title priest, I think, is a pretty good indication that we have a priest in front of us. How about when we have a priestly name, whether it's a personal name or a family name? Here things get a little bit trickier. So for example, we have this stone weight, which was uncovered in Area B of the Jewish quarter excavations, Nachman Avigad's Jewish quarter excavations. This stone weight bears the inscription Divar or Divrei, meaning the son or the sons of Katras. Now we have somewhat later rabbinic evidence for a family called Katros, a priestly family. And if we identify this Bar Katras as the same Katros family, then we would have a priestly family. But the question is, what does this stone weight indicate about the rest of the context, the archaeological context? This stone weight was found in a house. Can we call the house, as the museum curators have done, Beit Katros? Can we call it the house of Katros on the basis of one stone weight that was found in the house? I'm not so convinced. I'm not convinced that a stone weight, which, even if we agree that the name here is a priestly name, I don't think that we can necessarily come to the conclusion that the house in which the stone weight was found belonged to the person whose name is inscribed on the stone weight. Historical sources. In some cases, the identification of finds as being priestly are based on historical sources which relate to priests being somehow involved. So, for example, one can think of the Hasmonean palaces in Jericho. So here we have historical sources which relate to the Hasmonean family having a residence in Jericho. And when the site was excavated at Jericho, and we have pretty impressive residence, which is identified as a palace, I think a good argument can be made that this palace or these palaces are actually to be connected with the Hasmonean family. The dating seems to correlate. I think a good argument can be made. We know that the Hasmoneans were priests, that we have no question about. And as a result, I think we can pretty confidently state that these palaces belonged to priests. Does that mean that everyone who lived in the palaces were priests? No. Does that mean that workers in the palace were priests? Not necessarily. I think that the value of this identification is somewhat limited, but I would grant that the Hasmonean palaces were indeed owned by a priestly family. But when we get to other examples, things become a lot more shaky. So, for example, we have, and I'm not going to get into the details about this priestly list of 24 priestly courses that supposedly settled in Galilee. This is a rather late text, which is attested to in various sources, in rabbinic sources, as well as in, I know of 2 inscriptions, which speak of certain priestly courses, mishmarot, that settled in various cities, named cities in Galilee, amongst them Sepphoris. The actual identification of priests living in or settling in these cities, though, on the basis of such a list of families, I think is very, very spurious. And this is already, I'm not the first to question this. This has been questioned previously. To make the claim that an entire city is priestly on the basis of this list of priestly courses, I think is very, very problematic. Association with special priestly interests, for example, purity and the temple. So this is a claim which is made very often. We have archaeological evidence for the observance of purity rules. 2 salient examples are stone vessels which were thought to be impervious to ritual impurity, and ritual baths, of course, installations which were used for purification. And the assumption is that priests were particularly interested in keeping the purity rules. If so, finds which relate to purity, stone vessels, ritual baths, could be an indication of priestly interest. Problem with this line of thinking is when we actually look at the evidence, we find both of these phenomena throughout the country in numbers which cannot be explained by priestly interests alone. So for example, if we look at ritual baths, we find these throughout the country, beginning in the Hasmonean period around the year 100 BCE, throughout the Roman period, at least throughout the early Roman period, we find these ritual baths everywhere. Everywhere where there are Jewish settlements, everywhere where we know that Jews were living, in Judea, in Galilee, in Transjordan, we find these ritual baths and in large numbers. So if we excavate a site, an early Roman period site, where Jews were living, we're going to find large numbers of ritual baths. And we find them in such large numbers, in such large concentrations, that I think we have to assume that this is something which was being done by everybody on a regular basis. So there's really no reason to see any connection between the ritual baths and priests. And the same can be said for stone vessels. So again, our understanding is the reason why, these stone vessels, by the way, we find specifically in Jewish sites. So this is a Jewish phenomenon, but it's not a priestly phenomenon. We find these stone vessels throughout the Jewish area of settlement in Judea, in Galilee, in Transjordan. We find almost no stone vessels in Samaria. This is specifically a Jewish phenomenon. It's not a Samaritan phenomenon. But we find it in such large numbers and in such a wide dispersion that there's absolutely no reason to connect these stone vessels with priests or with any other specific Jewish group. This was a very Jewish phenomenon, but it was widespread. We find these vessels in Jerusalem, but we find them in Galilee, as I said, in Qumran. We find them everywhere. As Shai had mentioned, I'm excavating now 2 sites in Galilee, and I've just put them on the map to show the distance from Jerusalem, right? There's really no connection to think that these sites had anything to do with Jerusalem, the temple, or the priests. Both of these sites were quarries and workshops where these stone vessels were actually produced. And again, the geographical location of these sites and the dating of these sites is also important to note, that these stone vessels continue to be produced following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, which again, I think, in my mind, divorces the phenomenon from the temple and from the priesthood. So again, I see no reason to connect either of these phenomenon with either the temple or with priests. If so, what's the connection between purity and the temple or priesthood? I don't see any. I don't see any connection between purity and the temple and priesthood, aside from the fact that purity was a requirement in the temple. Outside of the temple, it might have been less severe. I give the example of perjury. It's always a bad thing to lie. But in a court, it's particularly severe. I think purity can be seen in a very similar way. Purity is a good thing, but it's particularly severe if one goes into the temple in an impure state. Other items which have been identified as priestly because of their putative connection to the temple, the menorah. Okay, so we have artistic depictions of the menorah. And here I would say, yes, the menorah is certainly connected to the temple. In later periods, we find the menorah as a general symbol of Judaism. In this earlier period, what I know is that the menorah is mentioned or described actually in detail in the book of Exodus. And this is something which was common to all Jews. I don't see a reason to think that the person, as has been claimed, that the person who etched this menorah into the plaster in this house in the Jewish quarter was necessarily a priest. I don't think that there's any reason actually to think that the person who etched this menorah into the plaster in the wall of a house in the Jewish quarter ever saw the menorah with his own eyes. I think that he did either read about it in the book of Exodus, as we all have, or he heard this description being read in his local synagogue, but there's no reason to think that this was necessarily a priest who had interest in the menorah or the other possibly temple-related items that we see here. And finally, association with wealth. Often the claim is made that priests were wealthy, and the claim goes something like this. It's basically based on a fallacious statistical syllogism which goes like this. Most priests were wealthy. I'm not sure where that claim comes from. Well, I know where the claim comes from, but it's okay. Let's assume that that's true, that most priests were wealthy. Then the claim is made that the residents of House X were wealthy. That's a claim which I can accept. If we have evidence of wealth, I think we can accept the claim that the residents of House X were wealthy. Ergo, residents of House X were likely priests. Now this makes sense. Right? If we read this, it makes sense. If you don't put the title above, calling it a fallacious syllogism, it reads well, and we can read and go on. But if logic is important to us, then I think it's very clear that this just doesn't go. And if you don't understand this, then I would give the example. Most students at Tel Aviv University are intelligent. Y is intelligent. Ergo, Y is likely a student at Tel Aviv University. Okay? So this doesn't lead logically. Now, I think it goes without saying that if we add up a couple of indications of priestly nature of finds, that we still don't get a priest, right? As my mother always told me, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Okay, so 2 fallacious logical inferences don't make a priest. So, for example, we have just recently there was this article that came out in the Times of Israel that Magdala was, after 7 years of excavations at Magdala, 4 rare ritual baths and a unique carved stone point to the importance of an ancient fishing town to the priestly class. Okay, again, ritual baths we find all over the place, and there's no reason to think that a menorah would necessarily point to priests. Or another example where we have a couple of wrongs trying to make a right, Jason's tomb. The claim is made that we have clearly a wealthy tomb, the tomb of a wealthy person. Inscribed in the wall of the tomb are menorot. And the name Jason is a priestly name because we find lots of priests with the name Jason. Growing up in elementary school, I had a friend named Jason. He wasn't a priest. He was wealthy. And if I'm not mistaken, he was a Levite. So, conclusions. I'm skeptical. And it's always annoyed me seeing claims of, whenever I see the word priestly in archaeological literature, it makes my skin crawl. More often than not, the claim has very little basis. In later periods, we do have material remain indications of priesthood. For example, this is much later periods that we begin to have the priestly blessing. But my conclusion is that not everything that looks priestly necessarily is. So the association of the stone vessels with purity, I think, is a good one. I don't have enough time to get into all the details, but on a very quickly, what I would say is this. We find, as I said, we find these stone vessels only in Jewish areas. We find almost none anywhere outside of places which we know to have been Jewish. So I think that it is legitimate to call these a Jewish phenomenon. The question then becomes, why were Jews using these stone vessels? And here we do have written evidence which does relate the use of stone to purity. We have early references both in the rabbinic literature and in the Gospel of John, which relate the use of stone to purity observance. So here I would say that we do have a good reason to think that these stone vessels were used by Jews for reasons of purity, but what I am arguing here is that we should divorce this connection between purity and the priesthood.
I was wondering with the Wealth Association, because of course in Hereditary, Hellenized areas, it's true, priests are wealthy because they have to pay so much to be priests, and that would keep it, so maybe that's, perhaps, I don't know, I mean.
Okay, so as Aaron told us, which he thought it was a joke, but it's true, you can't buy the priesthood. As far as we know, I'm sorry?
In Greece, yes. Yeah.
Okay, but not, when we're talking about Second Temple period Judaism, the priesthood was hereditary.
But I just thought the association might.
Oh, because of that?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting, I know, yeah. All right.
Just out of one ignorance, but you showed a picture of your excavation in Yonatan.
Mm-hmm.
You showed how far it was from Jerusalem, but it was close to Tzipori. Is that relevant?
Yes, it is close to Tzipori. You're right. It's not far from Tzipori. Again, I don't see any reason to think that there is any relevance here. Yeah, if you want to connect, again, making two wrongs a right, I don't think is. But we find these stone vessels. If we go back one slide, we find them everywhere. They're everywhere throughout the country.
Thank you very much. Question out of ignorance. My own field is also India. It's also one in which priesthood is hereditary. And I'm interested in how priesthood is seen as a potential within particular lineages. So in my field, priests, prestigious priests are Brahmins. Not all Brahmins are priests, but all Brahmins, by a series of textual assumptions about the kinds of person that Brahmins are, all Brahmins have the potential to be priests. And I wonder how this, again, is a very ignorant question, I'm afraid.
Okay.
How does this work with your lineages?
Okay, so this is no connection to archaeology. This would be completely on the basis of written sources. As far as I know, at this point, priesthood is hereditary and it's automatic. Okay, so in other words, there's nothing that one. Now, that doesn't mean that one necessarily is a priest serving in the temple, but the identification of a person as priestly is automatic from the moment the person is born. If one is born to a priestly father, one is a priest.
But I suppose it's a question of evidence. Presumably in most families, not all sons have the capacity to act as priests, or the skill, or the...
Okay, so
maybe simply priests, but not practicing.
so there's a distinction. For perhaps the term priest we should rethink, but as a Kohen is someone who is born to a father who is a Kohen. And we have already in the Pentateuch, in the priestly sources, we have things which would disqualify a person from serving in the temple, but that doesn't take away the priestly status. The priestly status relates to things aside from just serving in the temple. For example, the ability to eat or to receive priestly gifts and so on.
I mean, there are very close parallels with the Indian
Okay.
position.
Paul, you more or less asked my question, but I am curious about priestly because it does sound to me a little bit off. So I'm interested in the narrative of priestly. I think I know the answer, but I assume that there is
For some reason, archaeologists think that knowing stuff is a good thing. They think that if I can say that this house belonged to somebody, if I can say that this seal, if I can identify this person as somebody who's written in some written source, that's a good thing. I think the value is in knowing if saying what we can actually know it has value. I don't think that there's much value in just, making claims. So yeah, the value is being able to make claims.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think very often having something that can be identified with a tangible connection to the biblical text, the historical text, etc., adds sexiness to the story that you're telling. It appears on the New York Times front cover. Volunteers come to your excavation. Donors give money to your excavation. etc. And in some cases also, it's misused for national political reasons. So there's a whole layers and layers of narrative.
I can say from my personal experience with this excavation at Yonatan, the site is close to Sepphoris, true, but most people don't know what Sepphoris is. It's also close to Cana, the biblical Cana, where we have the story in John 2:6 of Jesus turning the water into wine. And if you look in John 2:6, you'll see that the water was held in stone jars. So of course the media hit on that we have the workshop where the stone jars of Jesus were produced.
You didn't tell them that they're wrong.
His father.
I hope you didn't tell them that they're wrong, so they wouldn't come to your excavation.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. I wonder whether you could say something to the effect of dating of the identification of something as purity, therefore priestly, or purity, therefore Jewish. I'm just thinking of the dating of most of these stone vessels as not, say, Iron Age 1.
No, the stone vessels begin in the second half of the 1st century BCE. They continue until it seems the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Okay, so this, chronologically, we're divorced by quite a few hundred years from the Iron Age. Yes, that's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer. I think that what people are doing, and I was expecting this question, the question which I was expecting people would ask was, why would non-priests be interested in purity? There seems to be an assumption amongst scholars that purity is a priestly issue. I think that Jews living during the early Roman period were reading the texts in Leviticus, which speak about purity, they speak about impurity. There's a list of various things which cause impurity and ways that impurity is passed from one person to another, from one object to another, without any connection to the temple. And I think that people were reading these and very simply understood that purity is a good thing, impurity is a bad thing. One should try to avoid impurity as much as possible. And this is what people were doing. Perhaps what happened, and there are certain indications in the rabbinic material that this is what happened, sometime, perhaps during the 2nd century CE, people started to interpret these texts as having something to do with the temple, that with relation to the temple, one had to keep the purity laws. Outside of the temple, it was optional. It was still a good thing, but it became optional. And it was perhaps this interpretation, this reinterpretation, that might have had an effect. Possibly it was an issue of things becoming difficult after the Bar Kokhba revolt. It just became really difficult to keep these laws. And another possibility is that people were not really keeping many of the laws after the Bar Kokhba revolt. There are theories that following the Bar Kokhba revolt, Judaism more or less imploded. And Seth Schwartz made this argument in a book in the year 2000. There are various possibilities for understanding why this happened. I don't have a very good answer.